Hello and welcome everybody to the Samvaad talk series on work and technology. Today, the title of the talk is Governing Artificial Intelligence, Reframing the Discourse on the Future of Work in India. We have a guest speaker today, Abhayraj Naik, who is a researcher, consultant, and advisor based in Bangalore. His consultancy and advisory work bring together innovation, research, strategy, design, communication, and implementation. He is currently a visiting faculty at the Azim Premji University and the National Law School of India, where he teaches courses relating to law, justice, and the environment. He has earlier taught courses on environment development, law, public policy, and research methods at the O.P. Jindal Global University and the Minnesota Studies in International Development India program. He is a graduate of the National Law School of India University and the Yale Law School. Welcome.
Very good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making it despite the virus scare, and I look forward to an engaging hour and a few minutes with you today. So I've titled my talk as Governing Artificial Intelligence, Reframing the Discourse on the Future of Work in India. And I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about my own state of mind and motivation as I speak to you, or as I start to speak to you today, right? So one part of my research over the last 8 months of 2019 involved a framing of ethics and artificial intelligence in India. And this was a commissioned study that was carried out for a Delhi-based nonprofit called the Software Freedom Law Center. And the context in which that study was commenced was there's a lot of movement happening with data protection debates in India. Across the world, particularly at the European Union level, but also in the US, regulation of technologies are forcing people to take stock of what is really at stake in the intersection between technology and society. And of course, the Cambridge Analytica incident, along with sort of anti-monopoly suits against Google in Europe, were some of the big cases that gripped the attention not just of rights-promoting activists, but also technology designers and business strategists. And there was a recognition that, in a sense, artificial intelligence is not far away in India. It's already here. We're seeing our lives mediated from a number of critical sectors, including defense and military applications, core agricultural functions, to the more mundane and banal, retail, shopping, and dating, though some would disagree whether dating is a banal activity, being mediated by artificial intelligence, right? India's regulatory framework, India's legal framework, India's policy framework, according to the people who commissioned that research, didn't seem to have a clear fix on where the problems are, what is at stake as these technologies become more and more ubiquitous in our lives, and how might we begin to have an appropriate Indian double quote approach to the saturation of these technologies across the country, right? And having started with that brief and getting into the research, I discovered that answering the question of how should artificial intelligence be regulated in India took me to much deeper terrain relating to bodies of knowledge that are not normally invoked in discussions on artificial intelligence. I immediately discovered that there is a particular history to science and technology in India, which results in science and technology playing out in particular ways in societal contexts. I required that there is a body of knowledge relating to the philosophy of technology that becomes particularly relevant while talking about new disruptive technologies, including quantum computing, synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and the old question of what is technology for gets reframed with a particular new vibrancy and urgency in the context of what AI can or might or should not do in the context of a society that we want to live in, right? I discovered, most importantly, that though there is a lot of speculative talk when it comes to artificial intelligence in India, and some of this is driven by big consultancy excitement about the prospects of work relating to AI strategy, publicly there is very little information available on what technologies are being developed by which companies for what purposes, right? There is, in the public arena at least, a big black hole when it comes to answering these specific empirical questions of which technologies, by who, and for what purposes. And so my project, from being one of how should we regulate AI in India, became one of how does one even begin to ask that question and answer that question? What are the prior knowledges that are required to meaningfully understand that question? Where might computer scientists benefit from a conversation with an ethicist or a philosopher of technology, a historian, or a business specialist in that sense, right? And I discovered that that linking between disciplines became quite key, just in light of the nature of the scholarship that was available relating to artificial intelligence. So many months later, after rambling in my head through a number of different scenarios relating to artificial intelligence, I finally managed to achieve some closure with that project. I put together what I thought was a good starting set of disciplines and interlinking between disciplines to allow us to answer the question of artificial intelligence and its regulation in India, right? And the conclusion or the orientation of that initial research was that a standard American approach, which says innovation is great, and we have the scientific knowledge to deal with the risks that innovation poses, is not suited for India. Second, a European approach, which says that science is messy, and let's always be a bit ambivalent about science, because just innovation and science related to innovation can't deal with all the solutions, is also not an option for India, right? So in a sense, at the end of that project, I was in a position where we must do the hard work of coming up with a distinctively Indian strategy and policy towards AI regulation, right? And that project having concluded, very quickly I got into conversation with colleagues from this institute who were keen on studying automation in the context of India. We're keen on studying the impact of automation on workers, on work, and on broader economic, social, and political questions that underpin these phenomena of workers and work, right? And this, of course, was something that I had touched in my earlier work while thinking about ethics and artificial intelligence. But this new inquiry, and I must share that we are at very early stages in thinking this project through, is forcing me to re-examine each of these big questions in terms of what is technology, what is the purpose of technology, how does one really think of ethical technology, and what might in a realistic sense be the best way of regulating or controlling the ill effects of bad technology, right? And so my comments today come from this in-between position where I'm still figuring out artificial intelligence and its connection to work, this opportunity has given me a chance to get what I think are some parts of the jigsaw into a box. And before I even get into any of my slides here, I want to say that my box of jigsaw puzzle pieces is an incomplete set. Okay, there are big fragments of that jigsaw puzzle picture that are still missing, and I can see that. And I'm hoping that in and through conversations such as this, I become, and my colleagues here and other researchers who are looking into the future of work and the future of workers across the world, get some sense of where the research needs to happen. So admittedly, the conversation today, at least at my end, is sometimes going to be speculative, sometimes going to be at a high-level abstraction, is sometimes going to raise more questions rather than provide neat answers, right? And given my own location as a lawyer who loves postmodern continental European philosophy and wants to be a philosopher but can't really say it in public conversation because I'm not professionally qualified, that level of abstraction is a very comfortable place to be. Right? That said, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm in a setting where closing out confusions and having fixed error rates and stress testing until you no longer have any stress might be your dominant ontologies, where that is the way of being that you're most comfortable with, or some of you might be most comfortable with. And I do honestly believe that the conversation between these two perspectives is rather fruitful, right? Where how one deals with uncertainty and how one deals with what is at stake come into the frame much more clearly. So this is a cartoon I just want you all to spend some time looking at and pondering over. Okay. The text at the bottom, for those who are struggling to read it, one nurse is saying to the other, he's being returned to the supplier. It turns out that his running costs are higher than our wages, right? And when I looked at this cartoon, it brought to my mind very many interesting questions and thoughts, and therefore I thought I'll give your brains the opportunity also to go on this multi-sensorial journey. One was, why is the robotic nurse wearing that little cap on? Is it just to make it more visibly a nurse in that sense? And that's the most trivial of the thoughts that came to my mind. But it brings to mind functionality versus appearance versus connection to what we as humans are familiar with in a world that increasingly sees robos operating in realms where they weren't there before. But I think it's the text that really gets me thinking, and in a sense surfaces some of what I think all of us should be thinking about, right? In this case, the machine that has been created is arguably as efficient, if not more efficient, and I'll use that word efficient again with double quotes on, than the human nurses in the frame, right? The conversation between the nurses doesn't seem to suggest that the machine is at risk of running amok and killing people. Okay, it's not a super intelligence that's going to take over the world. That machine is, at least that line there doesn't seem to suggest that there is any risk of that machine sort of discriminating between skin color or between people of different gender or between people of different castes or ethnicities. The sort of reason the robo is being sent back is very simply because that robo is going to be more expensive than a nurse, right? And in a sense, for me, that brings to light very clearly that in all our discussions on artificial intelligence and work, as we talk about efficiencies, as we talk about functionality, as we talk about risks, which might include risks such as bias and discrimination, which is the one that machine learning scientists have to most often deal with in their work, we often seem to forget the fact that we live in a capitalist world, right? And more often than not, there is a economic logic that is the reason why things get shaped the way they are shaped, right? And in that capitalist world, there might be a spectrum. You might have a liberal market, which is the US. You might have a collective market situation like the Scandinavian countries, right? But the logic of profit for a particular identified set of people continues to be the overriding concern. And so examples such as a supersonic jet that can get us from place A to place B in half a day and will probably result in many airline workers losing their jobs have been around for the last 25 years. We have the knowledge required to build something like that, right? It's just that we aren't building something like that because it's prohibitively expensive. The third point here, and I like the sort of nonchalance on the faces of these nurses. They're like totally cool. This robo nurse was here. Maybe they've developed a particular friendship with it. And they're like, okay, apparently he's going back. It's just like someone's coming and someone's leaving because of something at home that recalled them, right? And in a sense, the centrality of affect, of emotion, of psychological reactions to machines as a way of thinking or as a frame of thinking about artificial intelligence and work, for me is something that I'd like to sort of flag post very early in my comments today, right? So my main motivation in this talk is to talk about frames and framing, right? So this talk and the energies that generated it are an exercise in framing. And when I say framing, I refer to three people. I refer to, and don't trouble yourself with the text if it's too small. I refer to Gregory Bateson. I refer to the sociologist Erving Goffman, and I refer to the impossibly confusing French post-structuralist philosopher Jacques Derrida, who have all engaged with the idea of a frame in what I think is a very productive and constructive way. Bateson points out that a frame is a psychological concept influenced by culture and context, right? And why is it important? Because the frame is a spatial and temporal bounding of a set of interactive messages, right? And just a little while earlier today at lunch, a colleague pointed out, what am I to make of this coronavirus business, right? At one level, people are scaremongering. At another level, people are saying, hey, you better be scared because this is not your regular flu. At a third level, there are conspiracy theories about how this is a US PSYOPs plan to destabilize China. At a fourth level, there is the Hindutva brigade in India identified as responsible for shifting focus from the Delhi violence. We are being buffeted by all kinds of messages, interactive messages on your Twitter feed to your face-to-face conversation over lunch that make it difficult for us to understand what do we do when it comes to the coronavirus, right? And a frame is something that allows us to spatially bound those ideas, messages, and concepts, right? And in a sense, that is the level of the pitch here. I'm rethinking speculatively and inviting you to rethink with me the frame for artificial intelligence and work in India. Now, Erving Goffman extended the idea of framing from the psychological to the societal level, right? And highlighted frames and frameworks as central elements of culture and cosmology, the key word being as schemata of interpretation that allowed individuals and groups to locate, perceive, identify, and label occurrences, thus rendering meaning, organizing experiences, and guiding actions. Derrida, of course, told us in his impossible way, what can we learn from framing the frame? Right, the meta-meta question. And pointed out that the frame is the decisive structure of what is at stake, both for defining, and he was talking about the frame in terms of a frame of a work of art, both in terms of defining the ontological status of a work of art and for inscribing it within a system of value, right? And so this naturally brings to us, in the context of AI and work and workers, questions such as, what is really at stake in the context of automation and the saturation of artificial intelligence in India? Where do I set my frame? Is the frame one which says that, hey, you're going to make a lot of money and you are going to solve some pressing social problems, climate change is possibly going to be solved because of AI technologies, all your welfare distribution problems are going to be solved because of the ability of reinforcement learning to deal with these issues, and that is what is at stake at AI? Does the history of science and technology in India have something to add to that? Right? What basically gets included and what gets excluded is a part of this framing exercise. So the first point, insight, whatever you wish, for me when I was thinking about AI ethics work altogether was that one can't speak about the connections or relations between artificial intelligence, work and workers without talking about the larger political economy of data, platforms, corporations, and power relations, right? And scholars, social scientists, and technologists who have embraced a more critical turn have been pointing out that the platformization of the world is something that is here. The sovereignty of the nation state also no longer stands in the way of the platform. And the operation of that platform, the agglomeration of data for that platform, and the movement of data in and through the platform and a larger assemblage of platform and person is, in a sense, reflective of power relations that represent capitalism in its most predatory and terrifying avatar, right? And commentators will say that we are in a new era of surveillance capitalism, where what these platforms are doing, where the product is you, which is why all of them are free, is that they are understanding about your behavior in a way that can allow them to trade those insights in other markets that are invisible to you. And in a sense, they are almost reconstituting your very behavior, right? Someone like Zuboff will say this represents a frontal assault on our autonomy and liberty as well. And in a sense, I think thinking about artificial intelligence and workers in India in the context of this larger framing of platforms, data, power relations, and new evolving dangerous forms of capitalism is particularly important because of the context of companies in India, right? I, as an environmentalist, am constantly reminded of Union Carbide, Bhopal, and India, right? Who suffered, who died, who got disfigured? Poor, vulnerable people in Bhopal. And future generations who in 1984 were not even born got screwed over, right? Who was responsible for the leakage? A multinational company operating in the territory of India. Who failed spectacularly at protecting the rights of the most vulnerable? the respected government of India, right? And that context has not changed. You continue to have extreme corporate power operating in a schmoozy alliance with the government that is sort of devoted to accelerating GDP growth, quite often sacrificing, if not sacrificing might be a strong word, but yeah, sometimes sacrificing, but more often than not paying short shrift to the attention of impoverished people whose interests are implicated in the profits of the corporation, right? So what are the frames of artificial intelligence and how and why are these created? What gets left out and what gets included? What is the effect of a particular AI frame's operation? How does artificial intelligence mediate, constitute, and get affected by what happens both inside and outside the frame? What is the relationship between an AI frame and specific cultures and contexts, right? And here I'll just sort of talk about my colleague from the UCLA who's pointing out that the Silicon Valley and Chinese model of internet and technology frameworks are motivated by this kind of surveillance capitalism. But across the world, including in India, you're seeing brilliant design and brilliant technologies that are built on different premises that sometimes are not based even on an English worldview, that are more often than not inclusive, that are often being built with local materials and in a sustainable way, right? And specific cultures and contexts such as those for Srinivasan represent the way in which a technological world should move forward, right? What connects the AI frame to themes such as justice, rights, and violence? What might we discover in calling the frame into question, and how might we go about doing this? So let's look at what have been the main framings when it comes to artificial intelligence and work, right? The first frame, of course, is artificial intelligence and its increasing use in an economy will result in spectacular economic growth, right? And this is, in a sense, the discourse and the frame that is endorsed by the government of India. The Niti Aayog's AI brief, which one must admit has taken some good research, but reflects some good research, continues to unproblematically emphasize the economic windfall that is going to come to India from AI, right? I think the estimate is $975 billion by 2035, right? And that is a figure that has been provided to Niti Aayog by Accenture, who is publicly acknowledged in the report, right? And Accenture's estimate of $975 billion for India by 2035 is based on studies by economists which identify the number of jobs that will be replaced by automation, right? So in a sense, you're seeing how the economic growth is connected to the replacement of jobs, which is not presented as people are losing jobs and unemployment, but is presented as economic value, right? The economic growth hypothesis, of course, is problematic not only for what it doesn't tell us, it's problematic also because, in my humble opinion, it does not do a strong enough job of mapping out the scenarios of AI gone wrong, right? So if you have cataclysmic change triggered off by artificial intelligence, and that is not something that I necessarily want to identify as it's going to happen, but it's a probability that that figure that is coming from economic growth could very easily be diminished, if not wiped out, by a few such events, right? So does that mean there's not going to be economic growth from AI? No. I too believe in the transformative possibility of technology, right? And so for me, it's not a Manichean no AI or yes AI, right? It's just let's complicate and problematize and really get critical with propositions and speculations that are coming from a particular political or economic worldview. The second main framing with artificial intelligence, and this is connected to point number one, with artificial intelligence and work, has been that automation, and particularly automation of the artificial intelligence type, is going to lead to a huge loss of jobs, right? And two Oxford scholars were in the limelight on this by pointing out in their study that up to 40, if not more, 40% of US jobs were going to be lost in a very short time frame, right? Osborne and Frey, the scholars in question, their study, of course, has been criticized considerably, and right now the other dominant piece of scholarship in the area by three German social scientists points out that Osborne and Frey mistakenly assumed that entire occupations would get automated. So they looked at about 80 occupations: data entry operator, cook, receptionist, tax returner, figured out the kinds of skills involved, and then decided either 1 or 0 for that. Can be automated, can't be automated, can be automated, can't be automated, right? And the German social scientists point out that that's an incorrect way of thinking about what automation is going to do, because more likely than not, rather than entire occupations getting automated or total jobs being lost, particular tasks, which might be 1 of 10 tasks within an occupation, are likely to be automatable or non-automatable, right? Do you see the distinction in approach? So based on this approach, a slightly more sober figure of 10% of American jobs are at risk of automation in as little as 10 years, right? So the loss of jobs frame has been picked up by the Niti Aayog and the government of India. There is an acknowledgement, and if you listen to the responses of parliamentarians to questions on this, both in the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, there is recognition both within the parliament and within the executive that automation and AI pose a threat to jobs in India. There is a recognition that there is a need for reskilling workers who will no longer be able to do what they used to do. But beyond that, there are no details on how that reskilling is going to happen, who is going to pay for that reskilling, which, going back to my nurse robo picture, is the key question in any discussion on reskilling, right? Because the history of capitalism in its latest, most modern avatar, its neoliberal formation, is that public spending is not good, right? And so if the government has to be spending for reskilling, the internal logic of neoliberal capitalism will not like that, will want to shut that down. It just doesn't go with the forces that constitute that economic system, right? So who will pay for the reskilling is an important question. And some might respond that companies will pay for the reskilling, right? And just think about it, will they? Will companies pay for the reskilling in a labor surplus country such as India, right? And you're beginning to see that this way of thinking about it critically possibly forces you to ask, hey, which industry are we talking about? We have to get specific, right? And if we methodologically reach there, for me, that's a good way of thinking about it. Now the standard narrative that machines will lead to economic growth, those machines that lead to economic growth will take away jobs, has been complicated by Marxist historians and sociologists and their interlocutors, right? So in a sense, machine taking over jobs have been around since the Industrial Revolution, if not much earlier, right? And the growth of Taylorism, I think a couple of weeks back when Professor Vyasalu spoke about time and motion studies by the Gilbreths that were an integral part of our journey towards automation, we were seeing the same thing happening. What commentators point out is the difference now is the value doesn't necessarily go back to labor and capital. Now, because of what I said a few slides back, because of the nature of our platform economy, where Zuckerberg is pretty much, or Bezos is pretty much owning all of Facebook or Amazon, and Zuckerberg or Bezos are unlikely to actually spend a lot of the cash they get in creating new jobs and buying new products that require jobs, but they're more likely to park it in an account in the Cayman Islands or buy a priceless work of art, which don't really spur more jobs. What you're seeing now is that the loss of jobs and economic growth gets slightly scarier in terms of its effects on society, right? And that broad story that machines take over jobs, workers lose jobs, which let's say a Marxist historian such as Braverman has written on in some detail, gets complicated by scholars, let's say, again, a Marxist historian like E.P. Thompson, or a sociologist like Michael Burawoy, who point out that workers are not agency-less. Workers don't just see a machine come and, whoa, suddenly they're out of a job. Right? What happens in that relationship between the management and worker is a dance of control, according to these scholars. And workers respond to automation and machines in interesting ways. They try to retain control. They try to evade the effect of the machine on their workplace. They, as some recent research has shown us, they themselves rechange their professional branding. They say that I'm doing a slightly different thing because I used to sell insurance. Now Script is selling you the insurance you want. So now what I am doing is I'm giving you advice on how to plan for insurance in terms of your larger life goals. So my professional identity changes because of what the machine is doing to my task or occupation or job, right? So basically, worker adaptation, and you see this in many different ways, including, I'm guessing most of you have used an Ola or an Uber in Bangalore. There are many ways in which Ola and Uber drivers are adapting to the machine that, or the automation or the artificial intelligence that is trying to control them. And the example that comes most readily to mind is a pre-planned at 3 o'clock, we will all get on the app and suddenly become available, or we will all disappear off the app and suddenly create a shortage, right? So that prices go down or up depending on what we want to do. And you have drivers in Bangalore that are doing that as well. So that's been another frame that has turned the attention not so much on the large-scale structural economic logics that are used as explanators for machines and artificial intelligence and their impact on productive work processes, but a closer look at the actual dance between the worker and the management, or workers and the management. Which, I mean, the Humanizing Automation project that I'm a part of is in that spirit, acknowledging front and center that an ethnographic approach is important to understand the effect of technology on society. And that's partly why I find that project interesting, right? The person who I think is going to be in charge of the next Fairness, Accountability and Transparency Conference, the FAT-ML or FAT or FATE conferences, which are all the rage amongst those who are looking at technology and society. Someone called Claire Elish has pointed out, building on earlier work by scholars such as Lucy Suckman and Lily Irani and others, that it's not that people disappear when automation happens. They just get moved around a bit. They're somewhere around. And in that sense, that's part of a body of work that is looking at the visibilization of the invisible and the agency of the hitherto agencyless, right? And therefore, an ethnographic approach perfected by anthropology, but in a sense, historically belonging to a commonsensical approach of looking at people and talking to people before commenting on who people are and what they do, seems to be one interesting line of research. Another frame, of course, has been that technology, particularly algorithmic technologies, allow for micromanagement and surveillance in ways that were not possible earlier, right? A barcode reader, for example, provides management with information on how quickly or how slowly a supermarket cashier is checking out a full trolley of goods, right? And that, in fact, allows for you didn't do your job fast enough, you're going to get a 5% cut in your pay. If some deliveries don't occur on time, including deliveries within a logistic factory, just from place A to place B within the factory, all of which is monitored, tracked by virtue of technology, specifically algorithmic technologies, a particular worker stands to take a penalty, right? That first goes to the contractor, and the contractor passes it on to the worker in question. So the final point, which is the spirit in which this conversation today has been commenced, is another frame of thinking about AI and tech work is in terms of the new social relations that are being constituted, the existing social relations that are being challenged, right? And what future are we headed for? And this is where the science fiction fantasy stuff becomes helpful, right? Are we going for that dystopian future? Machines rule the world. All of us are jobless, useless. Even the prized creative functions can be carried out by a super intelligence. Or are we going to the other extreme, of course, a future where we don't need to do work. Machines do all the work, and therefore we sit around and engage in philosophical and artistic pursuits, or spend time with each other and just have a chill time, I suppose, with maybe the robos paying taxes, and those of us who need some money getting it directly from a universal basic income, right? What does automation and AI and work tell us or allow us to say about the big question, the who am I, what is my society, and what can I do to take my society in a particular direction, right? And I would say that whoever you might be, if you're thinking of AI, it's not grandstanding to imagine that this wave of disruptive technology might allow for a reimagining of the world, right? I certainly am someone who sees transformative possibilities and sometimes chases them. And for me, in a sense, technology and what it's doing to society, both in terms of the bad it's doing and in terms of the good it's making possible, represent a possibility of the world itself as we know it being reconfigured. So I'll skip this slide, but I think when one is talking about AI at a technical and technological level, you're talking about acceleration components and technologies, including MPUs, SoCs, GPUs, FPGAs, ASIC integrated circuits. You're talking about infrastructure, hardware and services, including servers, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, converged infrastructure. You're talking about software, of course, that is AI enabled. You're talking about development tools, including ML/DL frameworks, machine learning, deep learning frameworks, AI software platforms, conversational AI software platforms, text analytics, voice and speech analytics, image and video analytics, and AI-enabled search systems. Applications include conversational applications, computer vision, affective computing, intelligent automation, recommendation engines, autonomous vehicle software, and AI-enabled augmented VR. And finally, professional services, including AI business consulting, AI business process outsourcing services, AI IT services, and deployment services, which include IoT, endpoints, edge infrastructure, data centers, mobile, and public cloud. Okay, I didn't really skip that. I just read all of it out. So the usual algorithmic functions, right? The title of the slide has been cut out. So the title is the main kinds of functions that are being performed by this thing we call artificial intelligence in terms of its algorithmic function, right? So algorithms are searching, they're aggregating, they're observing, they're forecasting, they're filtering, they're recommending, they're scoring, they're producing content, and they're allocating. A number of philosophical approaches towards thinking of technology in an ethical way, and therefore, by implication, thinking of AI in an ethical way, right? At the top of that hexagon is good outcomes, right? So your technology must result in good outcomes, and your AI must result in good outcomes. Second, fulfilling obligations. Your AI must help in fulfilling obligations that you might have. Third, your AI must help in retaining trust and legitimacy. Fourth, the bottom of the hexagon, your AI or machines applications that are dependent on it, that is cut out there, but taking responsibility. Someone, usually the machine or its operator, must be able to take responsibility even when that AI is deployed. Fifth, the technology and the AI in question must help in virtuous actions. And finally, it must help in achieving purpose, not just in terms of outcomes, but achieving purpose in terms of you as a human being. So this is from an Australian publication, and I'm going to wrap up very soon so we can get into conversation on ethical design, particularly in a world of new technologies and emergent technologies. So when one is thinking about AI and its impact on work and workers, the breakdown of the technology into the different components of the AI cycle becomes important, right? Because as Claire Elish and others have again demonstrated, at each stage of the technological cycle, taking note of what action is being carried out and which workers are being carried out will result in different conclusions on whether that AI is doing a good thing or a bad thing, having a positive or a negative effect on workers, right? And part of how we frame the technology is usually full technology or no technology, right? And this kind of approach, which is being pioneered in the UK, starts off from a business and use case development, goes to the design phase, the training and test data procurement, building, testing, deployment, monitoring, which represents the full life cycle, right? So as you're thinking of if you're building a technology, or if you're evaluating a technology, or if you're evaluating the effect of a technology on workers and work, the suggestion is breaking the technology into its full life cycle allows you to be ethical at different moments and also identify impacts at specific moments. I'd just like to go back to that big question. So I am particularly influenced by two thinkers. One is Bernard Stiegler, who we'll skip for the moment, but the other is Louis Mumford, right? And Mumford's thesis, to put it bluntly, is that two technologies have recurrently occurred side by side, not in the last 50 years or 100 years, but he goes back all the way to Neolithic time, right? One is authoritarian, the other is democratic. The first is system-centered, immensely powerful and inherently unstable. The other is man-centered, relatively weak, but resourceful and durable, right? And writing in 64, Mumford sort of almost predicts where we are today and where we have been for the last few years. We're reaching a stage where technological development could lead to residual autonomy being wiped out, right? And some colleagues I speak with who are, again, coming back to dating, which we discover is not really so banal as a case study for human beings. Tinder, in a sense, is wiping out any residual autonomy you might have towards romance. That's the word on the street, right? Any courage and gumption you might build up to ask that person you're interested in for a coffee has just been converted to left, right, or whatever you do on that. And in a sense, you're seeing this. I mean, I'm seeing it with GPS in my own life, right? I no longer know how to drive around without a GPS-enabled phone or a GPS tool in my car. And my ability to, as I don't practice it, my ability to crank down my window, stick my head out and say, how do I get to X or Y place, is also getting attenuated in different ways, right? So the overall suggestion of this series of comments has been that rather than thinking about AI in terms of economic value or loss of jobs or good or bad, thinking of AI in terms of a particular emerging disciplinary framework of governance might represent the best way to take note of all the things that are in play in a increasingly technologically mediated world of the sort that we see with AI, right? And governance is useful for a number of reasons. One, governance theory, unlike regulation theory, has recognized that people and corporations and entities are being controlled not so much by state, but by a combination of state and non-state factors, including powerful corporate actors. Two, governance, like policy theory, is increasingly interdisciplinary. It is particularly well-versed to deal with concepts such as uncertainty. Three, governance theory, particularly governance theory as influenced by, again, a French post-structuralist thinker, Michel Foucault, gets to the heart of how governance constitutes subjectivity, right? So Foucault's seminal idea was, and I'm doing a real hack job here, was that someone like me, Abhay, is not fully constituted and operating as a willed individual in a world where I decide I want to do this and therefore I do this, right? Rather, who Abhay is constituted by the power relations I'm implicated within. So I'm someone's son, someone's lover, someone's student, someone's teacher, someone's employee, someone's citizen, right? And those power relations I'm implicated within constitute me as a subjectivity, right? And thinking of how we interact with our technologies, all those of you all who are addicted to Facebook or Insta or Twitter or your email or just your smartphone will understand what I'm saying when we say that technology constitutes our subjectivity, right? And governance theory already has a nice, rich vocabulary to deal with that phenomenon that makes it useful to employ it in thinking of AI and its effect on work, bringing in these larger dimensions of history, politics, power, so on and so forth. So as my penultimate slide, I want to end with a framework developed by, again, two German social scientists on how might we think of AI governance in terms of evaluating particular AI technologies operating in a societal context, right? And if you look at the x-axis, you have full automation, automated execution on the right side, to a recommender system which advises a human in the loop on the left. And if you look at the y-axis, you have a low transparency system, your typical black box problem with AI where you don't really understand what's going on because you can't really track what the code is doing, to a high transparency system all the way top, right? And this creates 4 quadrants that basically allow you to characterize the AI technology or system operating. And for them, of course, what's on the upper left, which is an autonomy-friendly system, would be the one to be aiming at, right? Something that's low transparency and fully automated can be characterized as an out-of-control system. Something that's high transparency and automated is a licensed system, and something that's low transparency but not heavy automation, that is, still has a human in the loop and relies on recommendation, would be a trust-based system, right? So what has been done, and I'll end with this, what has been done with AI and the history of work in India? The answer is not much in terms of scholarship. Platform workers, of course, have received the most attention, and the key insight to pick up from those studies is that while platforms in India are undoubtedly resulting in cognitive work overload, micromanagement, and surveillance, and this point I found interesting, interviews and conversations with platform workers in India suggest that many of them are still better off than where they were before Urban Ramu or whatever it is, Urban Clap, Uber, Ola came along, right? So contra the story we are getting from Europe and America, some scholars at least are arriving at a slightly more complicated theorization where given informality and given precarity in India, while platforms undoubtedly do negative things, increasing a surveillance culture and micromanagement of the worker, some workers within the platform economy are saying and also appear to be better off. And some of the positions that are articulated is, I work when I need to and I plug out when I don't need to, right? And this is just a temporary situation for me to buy a car or get married or so on and so forth, and earlier I didn't have this option. So in that sense, that complicates the story of platforms. And India, unlike the standard narrative that platforms are generally depriving workers, I think India, when we are talking about AI and work and workers, one has to take stock of the fact that 80% of non-agriculture work in India is informal, okay, and that is something that the scholarship has picked up but not deepened. One existing study of smart toilets as part of a smart city project in Pune, which points out that these smart toilets do everything for the vendors and for the users of the toilet, but don't do anything for the sanitation workers who work on the toilets, right? And two writers there point out that these sanitation workers are women and they are Dalit women. So in a sense, an entire culture of marginalization and stigmatization gets entrenched by an IoT-based smart sanitation system being deployed by the government. All of this gets outsourced to contractors, so the government no longer is responsible. Port workers, IT for Change has carried out a recent study. Port workers, about 45,000 in India. Over the last 10 years, 40 to 50% loss of jobs. Most of these port workers, particularly the ones carrying out the most manual work, loading and unloading, have not been able to find new jobs, at least in the context of field study carried out in one port in Bombay. My general opinion of the study is its method is not clear enough on reading to be fully convinced on whether these workers have not found alternate jobs. I'm not getting that from reading the report, but it looks like at least that kind of worker has been affected in a big way, because ports, as you might know, and logistics in general, along with healthcare. So logistics, transport, and healthcare, three big areas where AI-based technologies are being deployed with full force. Another study carried out on the Delhi police has pointed out that bias in the police's way of doing work in Delhi that predated the introduction of a algorithmic tool gets further entrenched after the introduction of the tool. So earlier, the police didn't want to record a complaint that came from a informal settlement or a juggi-jhopdi type area, right? And they either didn't record it, or during a particular time when they wanted to increase their numbers, recorded all problematic crimes from that area. Those kinds of institutional cultures get even more solidified by the introduction of a tool, which limits the number of areas that the operator can choose to record the crime for. And that was not the focus of the paper. The paper was focused on bias, but something about its impact on work cultures can be seen there. Finally, one paper again commissioned by FES and IT for Change has looked at the impact of AI technologies on educators. No figures available, but several problems have been raised, including who gets to use the data that artificial intelligence-powered tool picks up from schools and from students and from learning. What does this do to the educator's ability to provide personalized learning? Though Byju's and all the others we're all about personalized, but the educators interviewed said that we are able to really help each child in terms of his or her context in a way that any machine can't. Kind of like nurses have been interviewed in the UK context and have demonstrated how their emotional labor is what really is at the heart of the treatment that a patient receives, which simply doesn't get mapped onto the tool that is deployed to ostensibly carry out that function. So educators, still very early stage research, not much else known, but one can see an impact that is likely to be felt in the years ahead. So I'll end there. I'm not sure what the constitutional vision Janki mentioned. Why don't you talk about constitution also, or maybe at some stage? But I think the note, I'm going back to my original discipline. India's constitution says that the material resources of the community shall be so distributed as to subserve the common good, right? In Article 39B. And India's constitution also says that the state is obligated to provide for decent conditions of work. These are constitutional obligations that apply along with our right to equality, right to life, and right to dignity. So if we think about automation and an AI-powered technological future, maybe that might be where glimpses of a constitutional vision might be unearthed. So I'll end there. Thanks, and comments and questions are welcome.
So one of the things that has always surprised me with this area of jobs and AI is if you just look at US data, right? And I used to track that on a monthly basis till around about 12 to 14 months ago. So US typically adds about 200,000 jobs a month. The 5 industries which seemingly seems to be most impacted by AI and technology and robotics is construction, health, manufacturing, retail, and the other one is education, right? And there are a couple of others, but just in the interest of being accurate, these 7 industries result in 57% of non-farm US labor. And I've got data for the last 3 years from 12 months back. Consistently, this 57%, which should have been most impacted by job loss because of embracing of technology, generated 85% of the 200,000 that is generated every year. So it appears, and I have not done the double click, and I would like to kind of hear if any of your peers have studied this, is how come the industries which are embracing technology are the ones which are adding jobs, where the reverse is also true. If you're not embracing this technology, you're not adding jobs.
Sure, no, it's a great question, and I mean, I would need to look at the data set and unpack it more, but I think maybe I didn't say this clearly enough. At some stage, even within the Indian context, we have examples of AI adopting industries, generating new jobs. And I think the case study that comes immediately to mind is the partnership on AI's sort of careful examination of Axis Bank and its introduction of Axis AHA, a chatbot, right? So what happened in that context was the introduction by Axis Bank of this chatbot resulted in about 160, almost a 60% reduction in jobs of the customer service, third-party customer service vendor. But all of those people, of course, according to that company, were relocated. But for the development of the chatbot, for the fixing of the chatbot, for the maintenance of the chatbot, for the stress testing and validation of the chatbot, for general advice on the strategy relating to the chatbot, Axis Bank had to hire and reach out to a bunch of people. So in that context, that is one clear Indian example where jobs have been created as well, though some functions were lost and the vendor in question said they were relocated. On your specific within these five, I mean, do you know whether jobs are being lost?
So again, like I said, I've not done the double click, but I think most of the papers that I read in this subject takes this narrow vision of one area where jobs are getting lost and getting things. If you look in the context of Axis Bank, assuming, and this is speculation, but I know this has happened in other businesses, where the efficiencies that you gain through automation allows resources within the company to be deployed elsewhere, which are high growth areas. So the growth is, it's not that in that area of chatbot and customer servicing that you have job loss and gain, you actually have resource deployment through efficiency in areas of high growth. And it's happening completely else. Maybe Axis Bank is opening another asset management wing which they couldn't have had if they didn't have the resources. I think that's a more interesting study, and I'm not seeing too many people looking into that.
Yeah, and I see that as a totally plausible line. You know, I think that is why automation is valuable as well. It'll there is nothing per se problematic with an account which says that people will be freed up from mundane and repetitive job functions and can focus their attention to higher order functions. And I would suspect you will see that happening in some industries, right? My sort of broad brush approach here possibly didn't do justice to that position enough. And that's, I mean, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I see that happening. But I think what we should also see as happening is certain people will no longer have the ability to do what they did as their main activity, and they are not seen as worthy of these higher order functions.
Reskilling is a good question. So that's
yes.
open.
Sure. Thank you, though. Yes, sir, please.
A couple of questions. One is relating to your, there is a lot of work which has been done by NBER and Asimoglu of MIT on the capital labor replacement and the net economic benefits. So actually, Arvind is also working on along these lines. So there is some evidence of that. The second one, see, you pointed out about the fact that platforms have been useful in improving social welfare, right, compared to what was existing before. And that point is very valid in the context of developing countries, right? So, for example, we have inefficiency in everything, right? Information asymmetry exists. State does not do its job even though it is constitutionally mandated to do it, right? So we cannot really borrow examples from developed countries with, for example, as is applicable for countries like India, right? So, for example, even though you may say that platforms such as Uber and Ola or whatever it is have retained monopolies, but they have created jobs, right? So, the cab drivers who come from, Raichur, they have not had that opportunity before, but now they are getting it, right? Yes. So, it is quite possible that automation may in fact improve the social welfare much, much higher in developing countries compared to, for example, developed countries. So what's your take on this?
I think you're totally on to what is at the heart of my own curiosity on this, right? So even before I I read this research, I intuitively felt that I was reading about about Uber and then later Lyft's problematic practices in the US. And intuitively, I felt that that discourse can't be transplanted to India, because I was meeting taxi drivers, Ola and Uber drivers in Bangalore and other cities, who I could see that their lives were, all things considered, and I'll use that sort of phrase intentionally, were better off as a result of this possibility, that is a job with Ola or Uber, right? The human rights lawyer in me, of course, loves and gets seduced by rights violation, surveillance, micromanagement, datafication that is ominous. So those are things that I'm naturally drawn to because I know they occur in India in any way, right? So returning to your question, can automation lead to jobs in India? I don't have a sort of orientation or any reason to believe no, it can, right? Will those jobs be jobs that are overall good for the person holding the job? It's possible. Does that mean we should not be thinking of a situation where automation will not lead to jobs? No, we should be thinking of the other scenario as well. I think it's so emergent that one can't necessarily gamble on it happening that way, though at some level, at least with transport, we're seeing that possibility. The history of how capital has operated in India gets me a bit wary about being too generous to the possibilities, though, because I think even if jobs are created, are those jobs jobs that we should be promoting continues to remain a valid question. So even if someone is earning 30,000 or 40,000 or 50,000, if that person is being dehumanized, as a lawyer, I have a problem with it, right? Because that money and that job can't substitute for that person's dignity or liberty or even constitutional protection. And then we get to all kinds of questions of, so would you have it that he didn't have a job at all? And I might say maybe, right? So I think we'll have to get to that conversation on those specifics. But to return to your overall question, I think there's something special about informality and labor-rich developing countries with an unemployment and underemployment problem such as India that make the automation debate slightly different. Yes, sir.
So just on the same point, which you talked about, right? So are these new age jobs like the delivery boys and the cab drivers and all that? So is it just glorified sort of construction labor? Look, I mean, construction labor and this kind of manual stuff has been around for decades, right? People have been migrating or temporarily migrating from villages, coming to cities in the hope of getting a job like this and then gone back. But there are enough studies that these jobs haven't really pushed these people above the threshold of whatever poverty and all that, right? And so are these jobs that we seem to be creating as a result of large-scale automation? Is it just glorified construction worker? It might look glamorous today, but very soon it's going to wear out. And I don't necessarily have the faith that the gap between the people who are disenfranchised and the others who are the luckier lot is actually going to get bridged because of this.
Yeah, and I mean, macroeconomic data is supporting an overall conclusion such as yours. So I think a few things have to be pointed out, though. I think agricultural employment is going down across the world, and India is no exception to that general trend. The manufacturing sector and its employment is going down. The service sector is rising up. Public employment is going down. The private sector is taking jobs that were earlier in some ways connected to the public sector. So all of these trends are I think, continue to be part of the frame. That said, income inequality has been going up, though new jobs are being created, right? And I think that, in a sense, is quite similar structurally to what you're saying. That is, even though a lot more Swiggy delivery boys or beauticians on Urban Clap now suddenly have regular type jobs, or they're earning some amount of money that one links to a salaried job, are they, in a sense, financially getting closer to the top 1% or the 10%? No, they're getting much further away in that sense. The full story, though, I feel before I get to the full story, I think these jobs are, in a sense, sometimes more scarier than a construction laborer's job, right? Especially because of the micromanagement and the surveillance and the, I see some taxi drivers who are killing themselves just to earn some money, and the system is, in a sense, promoting that. The big question of does that money and job matter or not, I'm ambivalent. So I think at some level it continues to matter, and I think having that 30 or 40 or 50,000 is allowing someone to go to school, educate their child, go to a restaurant. One has to take note of that income in that sense. But is it necessarily a good thing? I don't know. Please.
Thing that you said, are they getting closer to the top 1%? Possibly not, but are they going away from the bottom 1%? I think that's what you should be looking at. I mean, we are too enamored and looking at the gap. I'm looking at the gap from the bottom. I'm too concerned with the gap from the bottom. You know, like I kind of, and personal experience, and I spent some time teaching in rural Bihar. And one of the PTAs that I did, I had 47 daily wage earners, which is the lowest of the lowest bottom of the pyramid. And each of those women, the men were not there. Each of the mothers, they had only one ask from me. Saab, isko sahar leke jana hai. And I asked him, who will look after you? He said, our lives, you see where we are, is not going to change. I want better thing for the thing. And clearly what you're asking for is, you need to take my kids to research. That's the palpable thing of the people whom we are trying to look at. Why are we second guessing whether they're making the right choice? So that's my question. I mean,
that's the feeling of the entire governance structure, right? People don't want to stay where they are. And
it's not only the way it works. If you just go beyond 2 generations, the farm remains finite. It's just unsustainable for the farmers to kind of have the whole family on the farm. So maybe have to
right. So, but why should they sort of completely uproot themselves and go astray? Why should the state be reaching out to them and doing something, right? I mean,
in the villages. In the villages, that I have not thought of. But clearly, they're looking at the city is where they're going to go to move away from the bottom part.
So that conversation was instructive. So I think one, you come up with a new version, like it might be a J.C. Kumarappa Gandhian, but applied to new technology vision of how can AI and technology be actually used to produce micro entrepreneurs in our villages. That might be one way of thinking about it. The other, see, I think moving the bottom 1 or 10 or 20% away from poverty is laudable and has to be appreciated when it happens. But especially in the context of platform companies where the good and the data is, in a sense, public, who's providing that ability and what are the kinds of value that is being drawn out of it, then it's no longer simply you want to think of, is the value being distributed fairly here? Is it all right for the owner of the company to be taking all these profits and the Swiggy man or woman getting so much and living this kind of life? So it gets complicated in that way as well, because it's not just a pure I am working, and by dint of my labor, I have the ability to set the price on my product, and then I can pay my workers what I want to. So that question of who owns that data, and can we have cooperatively owned platforms which people are arguing for across the world, all of that comes in as well. He has more thoughts, so we have to come back to him. He's thinking it through. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. So if we go back to, I think Professor Vyasulu did say that automation, if we, or crudely, if we look at automation as capital substituting for labor power, then obviously automation can, and then capital can substitute for labor power in so many different ways. And when we are looking at these kinds of claims that this automation has contributed to so much of job loss or so much of job gain, I think there's a lot of problem in the way we look at it, because in most cases we are not doing a counterfactual analysis. We are not saying that this capital that has gone there to substitute for this labor power, if it had gone there to substitute for a different labor power, what kind of job loss or job gain would it have resulted in? So in the context of the earlier conversation, if the platform economy capital would have gone to enabling an agro-processing industry, what kind of job loss or job gain could it have enabled is something that would, I feel, would be a better way to make any claims about automation leading or contributing to job gain, job loss.
Thank you.
And that is something that we are not doing at all.
I'm totally in support of that way of thinking of it. I mean, the example that I constantly think of is using satellite data and ML deep learning possibilities for water shortages, identifying water-rich areas for rural sustainability, which it doesn't get used for. But what it gets used for is for figuring out rental prices, gets used for figuring out which lipstick will look good with this outfit, right? But those kinds of usages are, I mean, we're going back to who makes those choices.
Thank you. I think we've had a very exciting and a very intensive discussion. I would request all of you to continue the Chai Pe Charcha outside. And I would request Professor Prabhu to give a memento on behalf of IIIT to Abhay. Thank you so much. And please, a big round of applause for Abhay. Thank you.